I'm Imogen Thackeray, 53, and I enlisted at 19 as a small arms repairer because a test said my hands were steady and nothing else in my life had worked out. For 32 years, I carried the rules a sergeant major handed me on a firing line, and I spent 2 of those years pushing the paperwork to get a range tower named after him. But when I drove out to that ceremony alone, and a captain looked at the folder in my hands and told me to wait by the trucks, I made a choice about what I was going to do next, and it was not the choice anybody expected. Have you ever been treated like furniture by someone who had no idea what you were carrying? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand still and hold your ground while a room decided you didn't count, hit that like button and subscribe. It was the spring of 1992, and I was 19 years old with a duffel bag and no plan past Thursday. I had worked 2 jobs since high school, and neither of them lasted. A parts counter at an auto shop in Bakersfield, California, and a laundry. I was not fired from either. I just stopped mattering to them, slowly, the way you stop mattering to a place that never needed you. My mother worked nights. My father had been gone since I was 6. Nobody in my family had ever worn a uniform, so there was no tradition to live up to, and no expectation to disappoint. I enlisted because a recruiter in a strip mall told me the Army would give me a job, and I did not have one. They gave me small arms and artillery repair. 91 Foxtrot. I did not choose it. A test said my hands were steady, and a clerk in a processing station typed a code into a screen, and that was the whole ceremony of it. A lot of people are unhappy with the job a test picks for them. I was not. A weapon either functions or it does not. That was the whole thing. In the repair bay, nobody argued with a headspace gauge. You measured it, and the measurement was the answer, and then you fixed it or you condemned it and moved on. I had spent 19 years in a world where every single thing was somebody's opinion about me. In the bay, I was correct or I was not correct. I could tell which, and I could get better. I was very good at it inside of a year. I made specialists quickly. I could strip and rebuild a machine gun faster than the sergeants who taught me. By 1994, I was 21, and I was the one they sent out to the ranges when something went wrong on a firing line and nobody wanted to shut the range down. That is how I ended up at Tower 4. It was supposed to be a 2-hour trip. A qualification range had 3 weapons going down in the same morning, which usually means a bad ammunition lot or bad operators, and either way, somebody wanted a repairer on site rather than a truck ride away. I drove out with a toolbox and a gauge set, and I was planning to be back in the bay by lunch. The range NCO was a sergeant first class named Alvy Ruck. He was 39 years old that year. He had a face like a man who had been outside for 2 decades, which he had, and he ran Tower 4 the way other people run a country. Everybody on that installation knew his name. About half of them told me before I ever met him that he was impossible to work for. The other half told me he was the best range NCO in the Army. It took me a while to understand that both of those were true and that they were the same sentence. He did not say hello. He watched me clear and fix the first weapon, and then the second one, and then he said the range was going to be cold for 11 minutes and I might as well shoot. I told him I was not there to shoot. He said the range was cold for 11 minutes and I might as well shoot. So I shot. I was decent. I had qualified sharpshooter in basic and had not thought about it since because I was a repairer and shooting was somebody else's problem. I put a reasonable group on the paper, felt fine about it, and started to walk off the line. He said, "You are not shooting badly, specialist. You are shooting carelessly. Those are different problems, and only one of them is mine to fix." I stopped. I want to be honest about what that did, because I have told this story a few times over the years, and people always assume I was insulted. I was not insulted. I was relieved. Somebody had finally looked at something I did and told me the actual fault instead of the general impression. He was not saying I was bad. He was saying there was a specific thing, and it was findable, and it was mine. He made me pull the trigger 400 times that afternoon. Not shooting, just pulling on an empty chamber with a spent casing balanced on the front sight post, and every time the casing fell off, I started the count over. I did not get back to the bay by lunch. I did not get back until 1998 in a sense, and by then I was wearing a different uniform. Ruck kept me. That is the only word for it. He put in a request for me to be attached to range operations, and then he extended it, and then he made it permanent, and nobody fought him, because nobody fought Ruck about the range. For 4 years I lived out there. I fixed the weapons in the morning, and I ran the line in the afternoon, and I learned an enormous amount about something I had never once thought about, which was the paperwork. That surprises people. It surprised me. Ruck's entire philosophy, the thing underneath every hard afternoon he ever gave me, was that the boring part is the part that keeps people alive. Surface danger zones, ammunition accountability, range safety certification, the control log, the medical evacuation plan that you rehearse when nobody is hurt, so that you have it when somebody is. He treated all of it with a seriousness that was almost strange to watch. And one afternoon in 1995, I made the mistake of calling it paperwork in the tone that people use. He put down what he was holding. He said, "Everybody wants to be the man on the firing line. The paperwork is what makes sure he goes home. Do not ever let me hear you say the word like it is an insult." I never did again. Not once in 32 years. I want you to hold on to that because it comes back. By 1996, I was 23 and a sergeant, and he made me a range safety NCO, and then he made me an assistant instructor, which meant I was teaching soldiers who outranked me in front of officers who outranked both of us. He did that on purpose. He never told me why. I worked it out about 8 years later. I kept a running tally in my head of what I owed him. It only ever went one direction. He gave me a trade, and then a standard, and then a career, and then a version of myself that I had not known was available. I gave him work. Good work, and a lot of it, but work is what I was there to do anyway. It was not payment. I knew the difference even then, and it saddened me like a stone I had swallowed. I asked him once, near the end of that stretch, what I could do for him. He looked at me like I had asked him something in another language, and he said the range needed the ammunition count reconciled before last light, and that was the answer I got. I remember standing in the doorway of Tower 4 that evening, 23 years old, sun almost down, the smell of solvent and cut grass, the count sheet in my hand. He walked past me on his way out and told me I was still pulling the trigger wrong, and I understood, standing there, that I was not being tolerated. I was being kept. Ruck decided I was going to be an officer about a year before I decided it, which is how most of the useful things in my life have happened. I told him no. I told him I was an enlisted repairer, that I had a high school education and a mother who worked nights, and that the officers I had met were a different species of person. He listened to all of it, which he almost never did, and then he told me to fill out the green to gold packet on his desk by Friday. I was turned down. I remember being relieved, and I remember him seeing that I was relieved, and I remember that being the only time in 6 years he was ever genuinely angry with me. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He said, "You already know how to do the job. All they are giving you is permission to sign for it." I applied again. In 1998, I was 25 years old, and I was commissioned as a second lieutenant. Here's the thing nobody tells you about coming up from enlisted. You do not arrive with an advantage. You arrive with a file. The officer corps read my background the way you read a limitation. Prior service, repairer, came up through the ranges. There is a compliment buried in all three of those, and a ceiling implied in all three too, and for about 10 years I could not tell which one I was hearing. What I had and did not understand was that I had run things. I had held a live firing line with 200 soldiers on it and made the call to go cold. I had written the medical evacuation annex that got used in 1997 for a real casualty and worked. That is not a limitation. It took me most of a decade to say that out loud. I made first lieutenant in 2000 and captain in 2002, and the career did what careers do, which is that it happened while I was busy. Ruck retired in 2005. 30 years. He was 50 and I was 32 and a captain, and he asked for no speeches, which is not a thing you are permitted to ask for, but he asked anyway and got most of what he wanted. There was a small formation at Tower 4. Somebody read the standard citation. His daughter Winnie was there, 13 years old, holding a program she did not read. He retired on a Friday and was back at the range on Monday. Nobody paid him. Nobody had to. He signed on as a civilian volunteer with the Range Control Office, and he kept showing up for 18 more years, and for the entire time I served, soldiers on that installation called it Ruck's Tower, even though the sign said Tower 4. I went where the Army sent me, Major in 2008, Lieutenant Colonel in 2013. I called him twice a year, and about a third of the time he actually picked up. Now I have to tell you about a lieutenant named Reese Tolliver, and I have to tell it here, because if I tell it later, it will look like I'm making myself the hero of something. In 2019, I was 46 years old and a colonel, and I was appointed president of a board of inquiry. A first lieutenant had run a night live fire at an installation range, and a soldier had been badly injured. Not killed. Badly injured. The lieutenant was 24 years old, and his name was Tolliver, and by the time the packet got to me, the outcome was mostly decided. Boards are not supposed to work that way, and everybody knows they do. The staff summary had a recommendation on the first page, and the recommendation was that he be separated. I read the whole packet. All of it, including the annexes, which is a thing I do, because Ruck made me do it in 1995, and I never stopped. Then I drove out to that range at night, by myself, and stood on it. The control procedures were wrong. Not the lieutenant's procedures, the installations. The lighting plan referenced a fixture layout that had been changed in 2014 and never updated on the diagram. The ceasefire authority was ambiguous, in writing, between the officer in charge and range control, which is the single most dangerous sentence you can leave lying around on a range at night. I found 9 institutional failures. 9. I wrote them all down at the base of a tower with a red lens flashlight in my teeth. The lieutenant made 2 mistakes, both real, both his. 2 against 9. I said it in the boardroom in almost exactly those words. I said, "The lieutenant made 2 mistakes. This installation made 9. We are not going to end a career to avoid writing down the other 9. We retained him. I wrote the memorandum myself, and it went into the record, signed the way board memoranda are signed, which is by title. President, Board of Inquiry. My name is on the endorsement page, 4 pages back, where nobody reads. I never told him. I want to be clear that this was not a grand gesture of humility. It genuinely did not occur to me that I should. Ruck never told me which of my problems he had quietly solved. I found out about one of them 11 years after the fact, and only because a warrant officer let it slip. That was simply the shape of the thing as it had been handed to me. You do the work, you sign by title, the person goes on with their life, and you never say a word. So for 7 years I watched Reese Tolliver's file the way Ruck used to watch mine, from a distance with no comment. He made captain in 2021. He asked for range officer duty, which almost nobody asked for. He was good at it. I made brigadier general in 2022. And somewhere in that stretch I became a different kind of person than I had been at 23, and I did not notice it happening. I became the person who writes the memo nobody sees, who signs by title, who fixes the thing quietly and lets somebody else stand in the light. I told myself that was integrity, and some of it was. But there is a second thing that grows in that soil, and it took me until this year to say it plainly. I stopped expecting to be recognized for anything. Not in a bitter way, in a settled way, which is worse, because bitterness at least argues. I signed a memo with a title instead of a name, and I told myself that is how it is supposed to work, and I went home, and the next morning I did it again. Alvy Ruck died in the fall of 2023. He was 68. I was 50. I found out by telephone in a parking lot, which is where I have found out about most things. Took me a little over 2 years to get Tower 4 renamed. I say that because 2 years is how long it takes, and because I want you to understand exactly what was in my hands on the morning I am about to describe. A rededication packet is real work, historical justification, verification of service records, coordination with the installation's naming committee, then the higher headquarters naming authority, then the historical office. A funding line for the plaque, which I justified 3 separate times because the bronze cost $1,100, and that is exactly the amount of money that makes an auditor curious. I signed the final order in January of 2026. By then I was 53 years old, a major general and the commanding general of the Maneuver Center of Excellence, which is a long way of saying that everything on that installation was mine. I had been in command since 2025. 22,000 people came to work every day under my signature block. The rededication was set for a Thursday morning in March. I drove myself out. That was deliberate and a little bit self-indulgent. No aide, no sedan, no advance party. I took a plain vehicle out of the motor pool at 0620 hours and drove the range road alone with the windows down, in combat uniform, because the ceremony was on a range and you dress for the ground you are standing on. Subdued rank, that matters in what happens next, so I will say it clearly. Combat uniform rank insignia is a single subdued star sewn to a tab on the center of the chest. Dark thread on dark fabric. From 6 feet away, in bad light, it is a smudge. A general officer in combat uniform standing quietly in a doorway looks like a soldier. I had the folder with me. The citation I had written for Ruck, the ceremony sequence, and a photograph of the plaque so I could check the bronze against the order one more time. I got there at 0640 hours. I did not want an entrance. I wanted 10 minutes in a room where somebody used to tell me I was doing it wrong. That was the whole plan. The ceremony was at 0800. The honor guard bus pulled onto the gravel apron about a minute behind me, and I watched in the mirror as the color guard started to unload and form up. And I remember thinking that I had timed it well, that I had 20 clear minutes before anybody needed me for anything. Tower 4 had a live fire on it that morning. That was normal. Ranges do not close for ceremonies, they go cold for them. A rifle qualification had been running since 0530 and was scheduled to finish at 0715, which would leave 45 minutes to clear the line, reset, and step off. It was running late. I could hear it. There was still firing on the line at 0645. I parked and I sat for a second, and then I got out with the folder under my arm and walked toward the tower. There was a specialist at the base of it. Inez Palomar, 22 years old, running the equipment layout for the range detail, which is the job you get when you are competent and junior at the same time. She looked at the vehicle, and then she looked at the number plate on the front of it, and I watched her face do the arithmetic. She keyed up on her handheld. "Sir, that vehicle at the tower, the plate on it is, The answer came back across the net immediately, clipped, from a man who had a range running late and a ceremony inbound. "Not now, specialist." She let go of the transmit key. She looked at me. I gave her a small shake of the head that meant it is fine, and she went back to counting eye protection into a box, and that was the last easy moment either of us had that morning. I went up the stairs. A range tower is a small concrete room on legs, 10 feet by 12, windows on 3 sides, radios on a shelf, a wall of laminated diagrams, a logbook, and a public address. Speaker mounted outside under the eave that carries the range control net out over the firing line so that 200 people can hear one man say, "Cease fire." Everybody who has ever run a range knows that speaker is live and everybody forgets it about 4 times a day. Captain Reese Tolliver was standing at the center window with a clipboard. He was 31 years old. I had not seen him since the board in 2019, and he had not seen me at all because a board president sits behind a table at the front of a room and a respondent looks at the table. He was behind schedule. Hotline, ceremony in 75 minutes, brief not done. I know exactly what that feels like. I have been him. He was doing the thing every one of us does when we are behind, which is to sort every incoming stimulus into problem or not problem as fast as possible. I came up the stairs with a folder in my hands. He looked at the folder. "Just set it down. You must be the paperwork." I did not say anything for a second, not because I was angry, because of the word. He was still reading his clipboard. He did not look up. He said, "Wait by the trucks, ma'am. I will get to it when the line is cold." I said, "Yes, sir." And I went down the stairs and out into the sun, and I stood by the trucks. I want to be careful here, because this is the part people get wrong when I tell it. He was not cruel. He did not sneer at me. He did not mock me. He was busy, and I was a folder. That is a smaller thing than cruelty, and it lands in exactly the same place. I stood on the gravel apron in the sun and held a citation for a dead man and waited to be gotten to. The honor guard fell in about 20 feet from me. 9 soldiers, white gloves, the colors cased. Their sergeant dressed the line, and I watched him do it, and I thought, that is a good sergeant. He is dressing them off the man on the end and not off himself. Palomar came around the side of the tower with the box of eye protection and saw me standing there. She stopped. She had tried, 35 minutes earlier, to say the thing, and had been told, not now. And now she was looking at a 2-star general standing beside a truck like a contractor waiting for a signature. She could not hold my eyes. She looked away, and I watched a 22-year-old soldier be ashamed of something that was not remotely her fault, and that was the only part of the whole morning that actually made me angry. Here is why I did not go back up those stairs. Ruck's rule: the range officer owns the range, not the commander, not the general, not the ceremony party or anybody else. The officer in charge of a hot range owns every square meter of it until the line is cold, and the instant that stops being true, people die. He drilled that into me at 21, and I had relieved exactly one officer in my career for undercutting a range officer in front of his own soldiers. Tolliver had a hot line and a bad schedule, and he had made a call about a person with a folder. The call was wrong. The authority was his. I had been standing on that rule for 32 years. I was not going to step off it the first time it cost me something. So I stood by the trucks, holding the one document in the world that named that tower for the man who taught me the rule, and I waited. At 0706 hours, my executive officer called range control to confirm the ceremony sequence. Lieutenant Colonel Delphine Ose is 38, and she is the most organized human being I have ever worked with. She was back at the headquarters building running the rest of my day, and she did what she does every single morning, which is to close the loop on the next event before it arrives. She called range control. Range control keyed the net to answer her, and the net went out over the speaker under the eave, the way it always does, out over the firing line and the gravel apron and the honor guard and the trucks. Range control, the commanding general is on the tower. I have thought about that sentence a great deal since. It is not dramatic, it is a location report, and range control was doing its job, which is to tell everyone on a range where the people are. The firing line was cold by then. The last relay had finished about 90 seconds earlier, and the range was in that loud quiet you get right after. Brass being swept, bolts locked to the rear, 200 people talking at once. The apron went silent first. The honor guard sergeant turned his head about 15 degrees, which for a man dressing a formation is the equivalent of shouting. Command Sergeant Major Booker Nance, 52 years old, had arrived while I was standing there and was about 30 feet behind me with the ceremony party, and I heard him say something short and quiet to a captain next to him. And then Reese Tolliver came out onto the tower catwalk with the clipboard still in his hand and looked down and found the woman he had sent to wait by the trucks. I watched him work it out. It did not take long. He looked at me, and then at the vehicle I had driven, and then at the front of my uniform where a subdued star was sewn onto a tab, and then back at my face. And I saw the exact instant the whole morning rearranged itself behind his eyes. He came down those stairs faster than a person should come down range tower stairs. "Ma'am, I did not. Ma'am, I did not look." That is what he said. Not, "I did not know." I did not look. He was more honest under pressure than most people are with a week to prepare, and I noted it at the time even though I was not in a generous mood. Everything in me wanted to say, "It is fine." That is the reflex. Somebody is mortified in front of you, and you reach for the thing that makes the moment stop. It is not kindness, it is discomfort management, usually done by the person with more power for their own benefit and called grace. So I did not say "it is fine," because it was not fine, and I did not say anything cutting either, because his soldiers were 40 feet away, and half of them were already looking at their boots on his behalf. I said, "Finish your brief, Captain. The ceremony steps off at 0800. We will talk after." 3 sentences, level. "Not warm," he said. "Yes, ma'am," and he went back up, and to his enormous credit, he ran the rest of that range correctly. His safety brief was complete and unhurried. He cleared the line properly. He did not rush it to make up for me, which would have been the coward's version of an apology and would have been dangerous besides. I went around the back of the tower to get out of everybody's sight line. Osie found me there 4 minutes later. She had driven out the second she understood what the net had carried, and she arrived at a walk that was not quite a run, and she was angry in the specific quiet way of a person who protects someone for a living. "Ma'am, he sent you to stand by a truck." "He did." "For 20 minutes. 26, I said, because I had looked. She wanted me to be angry with her. I understood that. It is easier to be furious on somebody's behalf when they are furious too. I said, "He did, and I let him, because he was right about who owns the range and wrong about who was standing in it. Those are 2 different findings, and only one of them is a problem." She said, "Ma'am, with respect, that is a very tidy way to put it." She was correct. It was a very tidy way to put it. It was also true, and both of those things can hold at once. Here is what actually unsettled me, and I did not say it to her that morning because I had not finished thinking it. It was not that it happened, it was that it did not surprise me. I stood behind a range tower at 7:15 in the morning and checked myself for the feeling, the way you press on a bruise to see if it is still there, and there was nothing. No shock, no indignation, just a mild administrative note. A person had looked at a woman with a folder and sorted her into furniture, and some part of me had said, "Yes, that is the category," and had gone on holding the folder. 28 years of signing by title will do that. You get very good at not needing to be seen, and then one morning you find out you have also gotten good at not expecting to be. And those are not the same skill, and only one of them is any use to you. The range went cold at 0722 hours. The line cleared. The detail started dragging the ceremony chairs off the truck. And I finally got my 10 minutes. I went up the stairs into an empty tower with a folder in my hand and stood in a concrete room 10 feet by 12 where a sergeant first class had once made me pull a trigger 400 times. The logbook was on the shelf where it has been since 1994. Different book, same shelf, the wall of laminated diagrams. The smell, which is solvent and dust and hot electronics and does not change anywhere in the world. I read Ruck's citation out loud to the empty room, once all the way through to hear how it sounded. It sounded like paper. I had written it myself over about 4 months. I had gotten the service dates right and the campaign credits right and the phrasing correct. And standing there reading it aloud in the room where he actually did the thing, I could hear that it did not contain him anywhere. Citations never do. They are the outline of a person with the person removed. I got my 10 minutes. They were not the 10 minutes I wanted. I have learned to take the ones I am handed. At 07:45 hours, Command Sergeant Major Nance asked me a question with his hands behind his back, which is how he asks the questions he does not want on the record. "Ma'am, say the word and I will have him replaced on the detail." He meant it kindly, he meant it operationally too. There is an argument that a range officer who has just badly misidentified his commanding general is not the man you want fronting the ceremony 40 minutes later, and it is not a stupid argument. I said, "You will not. He runs this range. He will stand on it." He said, "Ma'am." And that was all he said, but I have known Booker Nance for 6 years, and he was pleased, and he would have been pleased with either answer, because his actual job that morning was to make sure somebody asked me the question before I got trapped by my own instincts. Here is the reasoning, and I want to lay it out because it is the whole hinge of the story. If I relieve Tolliver from the detail at 07:45, the morning becomes about me. Everybody on that apron watches a captain get pulled off a ceremony 40 minutes after he crossed the commanding general, and the story that leaves that range is a story about my dignity. It goes around the installation in a day, and around the branch in a week, and it gets better every time it is told, and forever afterward, that tower is the place where a general got insulted. The morning was not about me, it was about a sergeant major who was dead, so the captain stood on his range and did his job. The ceremony stepped off at 0800 hours. Lieutenant General Dorsey Quan came down from higher headquarters to preside. He is 60, and he is a serious man about exactly 2 things, which are the history of the branch and his wife's garden. He had known Ruck slightly, decades ago, as a young officer, and he had approved the naming packet without a single question, which almost never happens. Winnie Ruck came. Alvy's daughter, she is 34 now. She had been 13 at his retirement, holding a program she did not read, and now she was standing in the front row of folding chairs on a gravel apron holding a folded flag in her lap with her hands flat on top of it. The honor guard rendered honors. The colors came up. It was, I will say plainly, done extremely well. And the sergeant who dressed that line at 0700 hours deserves most of the credit for it. Captain Reese Tolliver stood in the formation about 10 feet from the podium, at attention, where a range officer in charge stands. I read the citation. I read the service dates in the 30 years and the campaign credits. I read the part about the ranges he built and the certification program he wrote in 2001 that is still in use at 3 installations. And then I read the last paragraph, which I had written last and rewritten 11 times. I said, in 30 years, he never once used the word paperwork as an insult. He said it was the thing that made sure a soldier went home. He taught that to every soldier who came through this tower, including a careless specialist in 1994 who did not know she was being taught anything at all. I did not name the specialist. I looked at the back of the formation while I said it and not at anybody in particular, and I got through it in a level voice, and about a third of the people on that apron worked out who the specialist was inside of 4 seconds, and Winnie Ruck worked it out immediately because she looked straight up at me from the front row. Then we unveiled the plaque. It is bronze, mounted on the concrete leg of the tower at eye height, about 18 inches by 24. His name across the top. Ruck Range Complex, Tower 4. His dates, 4 lines of the citation, and, because that is how a rededication plaque is made, a reproduction of the authorizing order underneath. An order carries a signature block. Imogen R. Thackeray, Major General, U.S. Army Commanding Cast in bronze, at eye height, 4 feet from a captain standing at attention. He did not need me to explain it. Nobody had to say a word to him. He stood in a formation on a range he owns and read a signature block, and I watched him understand, in his own time and without an audience for it, Exactly what had happened in that tower at 06:55 hours. That is the consequence. That is the entire consequence. I never said one sentence to him about it in public, that day or any other day. Afterward, Winnie Ruck came up and held onto my arm for a second longer than a handshake and said her father would have hated the folding chairs, and I said he would have hated the folding chairs and inspected them anyway, and she laughed, which was the first genuinely good thing that had happened all morning. The week after was worse for him than the ceremony was, and it was worse in the way these things are always worse, which is sideways. A post is a small town. It has one grocery store, one gym at the good hour, and an unlimited appetite for a story with a clean shape. By Monday morning, 4 days later, Reese Tolliver was the captain who sent the commanding general out to wait by the trucks. Nobody was cruel to him. That is what I want to make clear because I watched it happen, and it was not bullying. It was worse than bullying. It was a small pause before people said his name. It was two majors going quiet when he walked past the coffee. It was a battalion commander introducing him at a meeting as Captain Tolliver, who runs Tower 4, and the room reacting a half-beat too much. He got a nickname for about 11 days. It was accurate, which is the kind that sticks. He submitted a memorandum through his battalion on the Wednesday. It was a correct memorandum, formal, 4 paragraphs, properly formatted, no excuses in it. It said, "I failed to identify the commanding general's rank, and I accept full responsibility for that failure." I read it twice, and then I put it face down on my desk. He apologized for not seeing my stars. That was not the part that mattered. If a star and a chest tab is the fix, then the lesson he takes out of the whole thing is to check collars and chest tabs more carefully, and he will do that diligently for the rest of his career. And every single time a person walks into his range tower without visible rank, he will still sort them into furniture, and he will be perfectly polite to them while he does it. And nothing will have changed except that he will be harder to catch. Osei wanted it in his file. She came in on the Thursday with a written counseling drafted and formatted and ready for signature, and she is not a vindictive person. She is a thorough one, and her argument was good. Her argument was that an event that everyone on the installation knows about and that appears nowhere in the record is a rumor, and rumors do more damage over 10 years than a counseling statement does. I said no. I said, if I put it in his file, he learns to check collars. I would rather he learns to look at people. She said, "Ma'am, those are not mutually exclusive." She was right about that too. Delphine Osei is right about most things, and it is one of the reasons I keep her. I signed it anyway, in the end. Not the counseling. I want to be precise because I have told this part badly before. What I did was sign it and hold it and sit at my desk for a while with a signed counseling statement in front of me and a shredder 18 inches from my knee, and I made the decision twice before it held, because I wanted to file it. I want to say I was above it. I was not above it. Some part of me had stood on gravel for 26 minutes holding a dead man's citation while a 31-year-old told me he would get to me when the line was cold, and that part wanted a piece of paper in a file that said, "This happened," not to ruin him, just to exist, just so that the morning was written down somewhere in the official record of the United States Army instead of living entirely inside my own head. That is not dignity. That is an ordinary person wanting the world to keep a receipt. I shredded it on the second pass. And then I sat there and understood something about the previous 28 years that I had been carefully not looking at. Every quiet memo I ever signed by title, every problem I fixed without a name on it, every time I told myself that not needing credit was the mature position. Some of that was Ruck's lesson, honestly held. And some of it was that I had decided long ago that I was not going to get the credit and had built an entire philosophy on top of that decision so I would never have to test it. Quiet dignity is not a temperament. Nobody is born calm about being erased. It is a choice you make in a chair with a shredder next to your knee, and you make it again the next week and the week after that, and the only part anybody ever sees is that you did not do the other thing. In April, I had Osei pull the 2019 Board of Inquiry packet out of the archive. Took her about a day and a half. Board packets from 7 years back live in a records facility and come out with a cover sheet and a chain of custody. And she brought the whole thing to my office in a sealed envelope and set it on the desk and did not immediately let go of it. "Ma'am, you know that once he reads this, he's going to feel worse, not better." "Good," I said. Feeling better was never the objective. She let go of the envelope. "Here is what I want to be honest about. There is a version of this where I did that for the cleanest possible reason, and there is a version where a small, ungenerous part of me wanted the man who called me the paperwork to know exactly what the paperwork had done for him. Both versions were in the room. I am not going to pretend the second one was not. But the reason I actually went through with it is the first one, and it is this. He had spent 7 years believing he had survived that board by luck. A man who thinks he survived by luck learns nothing from surviving. He gets careful in a superstitious way. He does not know which part of what he did was correct, so he protects all of it, including the wrong parts. He needed to know it was findings, not luck. Findings written down by somebody who drove out to that range at night and counted. I brought him in on the Thursday. He came in expecting, I think, to be relieved of something. He stood at attention in front of my desk in the particular way of a man who has rehearsed a short speech, and I told him to sit down before he could deliver it. I gave him the packet. I said, "Read the memorandum, then read the endorsement page." He read the memorandum. It is 2.5 pages. He got through it in about 4 minutes, and I watched his face the entire time, because I had never actually seen him read the thing that had saved him. Then he turned to the endorsement page 4 pages back, where the president of the board signs by name. He stopped moving. He said, "Ma'am, I have spent 7 years not knowing who wrote this." I said, "You were not supposed to know. Somebody did the same thing for me, and I did not find out for 11 years, and then only because a warrant officer let it slip in a parking lot." He said, "Ma'am, that morning at the tower, I said, "I know." And I did not let him finish, and I want to explain why, because it was not mercy. It was that whatever he was going to say next would have been about that morning, and that morning was 3 weeks old, and I had already spent more of myself on it than it deserved. What was in front of us was a great deal older and considerably more useful. I said, "You did not survive that board because I liked your face. You survived it because there were 9 institutional findings, and 2 of them were yours." I wrote the 9 down. "Do you know what happened to them?" He said, "No, ma'am." 3 of them were fixed inside a year. 2 more were partially fixed. 4 of them are still exactly as I found them in 2019 on this installation, on ranges you have run. He sat with that. I said, "You are going to rewrite the range control procedures for this installation. All of them. Not the lighting annex. All of them. It is going to take you a year, and it is going to be paperwork." I watched him decide not to react to the word, which was the correct call and cost him something. He said, "Ma'am, may I ask a question?" "Go ahead. Is this a punishment?" I told him the truth, which was no. I told him that if I had wanted to punish him, I had a signed counseling statement in a shredder bag, and it would have taken 11 seconds. I told him that this was the opposite of a punishment, that it was the single most important, unglamorous job on the installation, and I was giving it to a captain instead of a colonel, because a captain would actually walk the ranges at night, and that in 20 years nobody would know he wrote them, and every soldier who went home in one piece would be partly his. That is the whole trade. He knew it when he heard it. Then I found Specialist Inez Palomar. That took some doing, because a specialist is not on anybody's calendar. Osei tracked her down through the range detail roster, and I had her come up on a Tuesday, and she arrived convinced she was in trouble, which is what a 22-year-old assumes when a 2-star wants to see her. I told her what I had watched from the gravel that morning, that she saw it, and she keyed up, and she got told, "Not now," and she stopped. She started to apologize. I said, "You saw it and you opened your mouth. That is the whole skill. The rest is just rank." Then I told her the thing I actually wanted her to hear, which is that being overruled does not make you wrong, and that the number of times in a career you will be right and overruled is large, and that the soldiers who quit opening their mouths after the 3rd or 4th time are the ones the army loses without ever noticing. She did not cry. She was composed, and I suspect she fell apart later in her vehicle, which is what I would have done at 22. I put her on the procedures rewrite. Enlisted voice, full stop, with the standing authority to tell a captain that a procedure does not survive contact with an actual firing line. They walked out of my office that spring carrying 4 binders between them, a captain who had called me furniture, and a specialist who had tried to say otherwise, and neither of them had any idea yet that they were going to be good at it. By May, the rewrite was grinding forward, and nothing was concluded, which is the honest condition of most things. Tolliver briefed me monthly. The second brief was the one that told me it was real. He said, "Ma'am, it is 17. I stopped counting at 14, and then I kept going. 17 findings. I had found 9 in one night with a flashlight. He had found 17 in 6 weeks of walking ranges after dark with a specialist and a notebook, which is what happens when you give a careful man the actual time. He was changed in the small, measurable ways that are the only ways that count. He had started calling range control by the individual soldier's name instead of by the call sign. He had put a chair in his tower, which sounds like nothing, but a chair in a range tower means people are expected to be in there for a while and be talked to. Nobody made a speech about any of it. He did not become a different man. He became a slightly better version of the same one, which is the most you can honestly ask. Winnie Ruck came back to the tower in the middle of May. She had wanted to see the plaque without 300 people around it, which I understood, and she called ahead, and I drove out and met her there on a Saturday morning. We stood at the base of the tower and looked at 18 inches by 24 of bronze. She asked me what her father would have made of all of it. And I opened my mouth to answer and then discovered that I did not know. I had an enormous amount of Alvy Ruck in my head. 32 years of his rules, his phrasing, his standards, the exact cadence of his voice telling me I was doing something carelessly. I could have told you what he would say about almost any technical question on that installation. I could not tell you what he would have thought about a bronze plaque with his name on it, because we never once had a conversation about anything that was not the work. Winnie said, "He would have thought the ceremony was a lot of fuss." Then she said, "He would have liked that you stood by the truck." She said it lightly. She did not know what she had said. I had never told her about that morning, and she had heard it the way everybody on the post heard it, as a funny story about a captain, and she had no idea she had just handed me the answer to a question I had been carrying since the fall of 2023. I drove home that Saturday, and I did not turn the radio on. Here is what I had not been looking at. I had spent 2 years and change pushing a naming packet through 3 levels of headquarters: historical justification, verification, funding line, $1,100 justified 3 separate times. I had told myself, and I had told OC, and I had told the naming committee that it was because he had earned it and because the record should say so. And all of that was true, and underneath it was a debt. I had been carrying a tally since I was 23 years old, in a doorway at last light with a count sheet in my hand. And the tally only ever went one direction, and somewhere in me I had decided that if I could get his name cast in bronze and bolted to the leg of that tower, the tally would finally balance. The plaque went up in March. Nothing settled. That is the part I had been refusing to say out loud for 2 months. The bronze is beautiful. The ceremony was correct. Winnie has photographs of it. And I had walked away from that apron with exactly the same stone in me that I had swallowed at 23, because you cannot pay a debt to a man who is not there to receive it. And I had built 2 years of work on a transaction that had no other party. I stopped at Tower 4 on my way home one evening at the end of May. The range was cold and empty. Last light. I went up the stairs into a concrete room 10 feet by 12, and I sat down in the chair that Reese Tolliver had put in there. And I looked at the wall of laminated diagrams, and I asked myself the question I had been walking around for 3 years. What did I think I was owed, and by whom? The answer came in June, on a firing line, in a form I would not have chosen. It was the first full qualification run under the rewritten control procedures. Tolliver was running it, Palomar was on the line as a safety, and I came out because a commanding general should stand on the ground when her people put something new into practice. And also because I wanted to. There was a private on lane 14 who could not hit anything. 19 years old. She had a good position, decent trigger discipline and dry fire, and a group on the paper that looked like somebody had thrown gravel at it. She had already been through 2 coaches. I watched her for about 6 minutes from behind the line, which is long enough to see the actual fault. She was flinching, but that was not the fault. The fault was that she had stopped paying attention to the individual shot. She was firing to finish the way you do when you have decided the outcome already. I walked down and knelt beside her, and I said it before I heard myself say it. You are not shooting badly, Private. You are shooting carelessly. Those are different problems, and only one of them is mine to fix. I heard it come out of my mouth in his cadence, and I had to stop and look at the floor of the firing point for a second. Then I made her balance a spent casing on the front sight post and pull the trigger on an empty chamber until it stayed there, which took her about 40 minutes and did not make her like me. Her third group after that was inside 8 inches. She qualified sharpshooter 2 hours later, and she was so pleased with herself, she forgot to be angry with me, which is the correct end state. Tolliver had been standing about 15 feet behind me for most of it, and he did not interrupt once, which I noticed. Afterward, he said the one right thing, and it was not an apology. He had already tried apologies, and they had not worked, and to his credit, he had stopped. He said, "Ma'am, permission to put that on the wall in the tower, not your name, just the line." I said, "It is not mine to give you. Put his name on it." It is up there now. Laminated on the wall of diagrams in Tower 4 in the same plastic as the surface danger zone charts, with A. Ruck typed underneath it, which is exactly where a rule belongs and exactly the amount of ceremony he would have tolerated. So here is where I landed, and I am going to be honest about the price of it, because I do not think these stories are worth much when people are not. I got the tower named. I got the bronze at eye height. I got the recognition, publicly, in front of 300 people. And I got a young captain fixed and a specialist promoted onto work that will outlast both of us. And the ranges on that installation are measurably safer this summer than they were last summer. And I would trade every piece of it for one afternoon of a sergeant major standing behind me, telling me I was still pulling the trigger wrong. Both of those are true. I am not going to resolve them for you because they do not resolve. The recognition was real, and it was worth having, and it did not fill the hole it was aimed at, and anybody who tells you the plaque fixes it has not lost the person yet. What did change is the question. I had been asking what I owed him, which is a question with no available answer, because the account is closed and the other party is not there. Sitting in that tower in May, I finally noticed that Alvy Ruck never once asked me for anything. Not a favor, not a thank you, not an acknowledgement. I asked him directly, at 23, what I could do for him, and he told me to reconcile the ammunition count before last light. That was not deflection. I had been reading it as deflection for 30 years. That was the answer. Do the work, then do it for somebody else. He never wanted to be paid back. He wanted to be continued, and the only reason I could not see that is that I was busy keeping a tally he had never once asked me to keep. I have been continuing him for years without noticing. Every memo signed by title, every board where I read the annexes, every 24-year-old lieutenant whose career I quietly did not end. I thought I was working off a debt, and I was actually just doing the job. Badly at first and then better, exactly the way he did it. The tally is closed. Not balanced. Closed. There is a difference, and it took me 53 years to find it. Things are lighter now, in small, ordinary ways. I drove home in daylight twice last week. I sleep. I am not rehearsing arguments in the vehicle anymore, which is a thing I did for 2 years without realizing it was a thing. And there's a 19-year-old private out there right now who thinks a mean 2-star general made her balance a piece of brass on a front sight post for 40 minutes, and who has no idea that she is the 4th generation of something and who will never know what it cost anybody. And that is exactly right. That is how it is supposed to work. So if somebody made you, do not spend your life trying to pay them back. You cannot. Pass it on instead, badly at first, to somebody who has no idea what it cost you. And if you are ever the one standing in the sun, holding the folder, while a room decides you are furniture, stand there anyway. Do the work you came to do. The room usually finds out, and on the days it does not, you still know what you were carrying. That's the whole of it. The tower has his name on it, the procedures are being rewritten by a captain who will never get credit for them, and I still catch myself keeping a tally I promised myself I'd closed. So let me ask you a few things. Have you ever done the quiet work for someone who never found out it was you? Did you tell them, or did you let it stay a memo signed by a title? And if you were standing on that gravel with the folder in your hands, would you have gone back up those stairs, or would you have waited by the trucks like I did? I'd really like to know. Tell me in the comments, and if this one hit home, hit subscribe.